The audio file will be saved in a password-protected folder and will be permanently erased after the study is completed. Do you have any questions before we begin the interview?
No.
I have prepared a protocol as a guide for this meeting, but because I am more interested in hearing your expertise in public history for the CRM certificate, I will tell you a general topic and ask a question connected to that topic and give you the floor to share what you'd like. For this first meeting, I will be focusing mostly on your experience with public history and what skills you would like to see students who complete the CRM coursework. So the first general topic for the interview is education. And I have one specific question. What attracted you to your field of study?
Well, thank you for interviewing me. I appreciate it very much. I was attracted to my field of study as a pre-law student. When I went to college, I thought I might become a lawyer, and history, political science were considered preparation for law school. I started as a political science major and became a history major because of the faculty. And the faculty impressed me, and I became a history geek. And history, like political science, is excellent preparation for law school. By the time I got to the end of my undergraduate career, I decided to study history instead of law, and went to grad school and have been studying and teaching and writing about history ever since.
All right. So even before deciding to become pre-law, what experiences did you have growing up that led you to either law, which led you to history? And why did you ultimately pursue your field?
Totally accidental. I was a student athlete in high school, and was not a good student by any measurement. I did have interest in some things, and history and government was always something that I was exposed to because of my father, because of my family. And so I grew up as kind of a political junkie, and learned history a bit later on. But I was an athlete, and I went to Boise State University to play baseball. I expected I would be a professional baseball player. And I had a conversion experience when I went to college and met some of my political science professors, my history mentors, and by the spring of my first year, I never went to the baseball team, never went out to practice. And that was the end of my baseball career and the beginning of my history career. So it really was, Donia, quite a remarkable conversion experience. Most of my friends and relatives from high school and my younger years would be and are amazed that I had that transition from a sort of a ne'er-do-well jock to a semi-successful scholar, or let's say in this case, semi-successful public historian.
So shifting gears a little bit, the next question has to do with other people. Why do you think people should care about culturally and historical significant sites?
Historians and folks like me believe that history is really important because we need to know about our roots. You know, the famous saying in history, those who have failed to study history are condemned or is it doomed to cost. And never forget, in one of my fields of study or areas of study in Japanese Americans, Japanese, never forget. So uh, there's lots of characters in history and then historians that believe that we really need to remember the past so as to not repeat those errors. There's a notion we can learn from the past. Now, in terms of cultural resources and uh, historical buildings, museums, libraries, they're the places that tell those stories. So we want to preserve antiques. We want to preserve the past so as to remember where we've been and to maybe hopefully guide us in the future. So there's lots of philosophical reasons why we might study history and preserve cultural artifacts. And then there's lots of practical things why we might talk about too. And just in terms of history has value, our old buildings have value, and historical preservation is good economics and good public policy.
Thank you. And sorry for turning off my video. We have unstable internet. So sorry about that. Okay, so going back to the early professional experience, like a little bit, I'll tell you, like the question is, tell me more about your early professional experiences with colleagues. So like right after graduation, what sort of relationships developed with colleagues that you can speak about?
Yeah, well, I had several graduations there in a fairly short period of time from my bachelor's degree when I decided to become a history graduate student. And that was because of my mentors and colleagues there at Boise State University in the late 1970s and early 1980s. I had a number of faculty there that encouraged me, and I applied to some grad schools, but it was accepted at Boise State graduate program as a teaching assistant of sorts. But before that, I received a fellowship, the Wittenberger Fellowship. And that Wittenberger Fellowship and kind of the support of the faculty at Boise State University encouraging me and then of course hiring me just about the time I finished my master's degree in 1981. I was 26 years old. I was hired by those friends and colleagues and people I had worked with for, well, really through most of the 1970s there as an undergraduate and then as a master's candidate. So it's a really interesting, seamless transition there. And I taught there at Boise State for 2 years. And really that's where my public school experience began, because I was trying to make a living as an adjunct professor and writing grants to make extra money for public history projects around the Treasure Valley. And then in 1983, I received a very fancy scholarship to the University of Washington, and I went there. I went there because of my colleagues and my connections, and I had a fellowship and there studied history at a very high level. So I was lucky from when I was 26 years old, getting my bachelor's degree, getting my master's degree, teaching for 2 years, engaged in some public history, writing grants, trying to make a living, but doing what I really loved right out of the gate, teaching, and then getting this very fancy fellowship to University of Washington, where I had a job. I was a teaching fellow, and all of my college was paid for, and they actually sent me a paycheck. So that's when I reached a level that lots of students are not lucky enough to reach, and that is having enough money to take care of your needs in life, and then just being a full-time grad student, kind of a full-time historian. And that's what I did in the University of Washington. When I finished in 1986, I immediately came back to Boise State, and that was another transition in my life, a crisis, because my mentor died at University of Washington, and so I didn't really have the same. Well, my path was disrupted, let's say, and my finances were disrupted in that my fellowship expired, and I went back to work. But when I moved to Boise State, and this is sort of my story, better lucky than good, Professor Matthews. When I moved to Boise State, my job was there, and I resumed full-time adjunct, and Senator Frank Church's papers had been moved from Stanford University to Boise State. Boise State agreed to create an archive. The church collection was moved there, and a facility was created, one of the nicest senatorial paper collections in the United States. And Boise State agreed to do that in order to get the church papers there. Of course, Senator Church, four-time Democratic senator. And I took a position in addition to my teaching as an archivist there. And thinking of public history archival work is a good thing to do. And as a historian, it's a good thing to do. It's taking artifacts, documents, and preserving them and storing them for use. So I worked 2 years as an archivist with the church collection, and that was the foundation of my dissertation. In other words, I was working and doing research and getting paid, and then produced a dissertation on Senator Frank Church in 1990 and had my PhD, but again continued doing exactly what I had been doing for a decade, that is teaching, doing research, publishing a few little meaningless things, and scraping along, writing grants and doing public history. I like to tell people I had these side jobs, sometimes construction work, to support my teaching habit. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer to get me to my PhD, when, of course, that's when your career begins. And I was 33 years old and taught for another decade at Boise State before I came to CSI, where I enjoyed a 20-year plus career.
So going back to skill development as you're learning about your craft, who was pivotal in helping you develop your skills for your own field work?
Well, there in my days at Boise State, I had a number of mentors that taught me about how to do research. And of course, I had a graduate committee and a number of outstanding professors. Boise State had and has a pretty fine program there. But really, as a graduate student, Professor Warren Tozer and Rolando Bonachea, who was a Cuban exile, and my interest in Latin American history and my PhDs in Latin American history is a result of Dr. Bonachea. And I spent a lot of time studying and teaching about Latin American history. But certainly, when I moved off to grad school, the folks over there, Carl Solberg, my mentor there, who passed away at the age of 45, and right when I was finishing my general exams there. Dario Alden, one of the leading Brazilian experts in the world, was my colonial mentor, and I had the chance to study under Alfred Rente, who's a leading environmental historian. So, along the way, I was very lucky. I had, countless people that I studied under, and you know the story of my Dr. Care. So yeah, I have important people in my life.
Did you
mentors that trained me, but my training was not in public history, it was academic history, and that was to learn about Native American history, learn about Idaho history, learn about Canadian history, learn about Latin American history, and then public history, something that historians tend to do on the side, or when you live in a community. When I was in Boise, I did Boise history here in Twin Falls, do Twin Falls history. And so that's sort of an obligation, a professional obligation to give back, that you have an expertise in. I think Dr. Gentry once told me there's only 45 professional historians in the state of Idaho. And so communities need professional anthropologists and political scientists and historians, what we call public scholars. And so, we get called in to make comments to the newspaper. We get called in to study old buildings to determine their previous use. And so there's countless public history opportunities. At Boise State, I taught a course, Introduction to Study of History, and part of that course is public history. What do historians do if they're not teaching? And there's a long list of things they do. But the public history movement of the 1960s is, you might call it applied history. So we study history, we teach it, but how do you apply it to public policy making? How do you apply it to cultural resources? Historians think that our insights, our information really ought to be the foundation of city planning, of state planning, and of national and international policy making. So this is historians entering the realm of, might say practical rather than at the ivory tower in the classroom. And so public history is a giant field that's grew out of the 1960s civil rights movement, really, and continues to be very significant here in the Magic Valley and around the country.
Did you feel prepared when you graduated for professional life?
Absolutely. I was prepared. I really did, Denier, because my experience at Boise State was pretty good. Now, let me back up and restate that. When I was hired, really before I'd finished my master's thesis, but about the same time in 1981, I was 26 years old, and I just was finishing my master's, and I thought I was a real smarty pants for sure. Now, you never really know how much you don't know until you teach it, or of course, generally we say you learn your history when you actually teach it as opposed to being a student. And so the first 5-10 years as a teacher is when I really learned history, as opposed to the time as a student. It's one thing teaching it, is another thing studying it. And so I was 26 years old, finishing my master's degree, teaching world history, and my preparation to teach what we called Western civilization then was taking a class, Western civilization, 101, 102, 103 back in the day. It was a 3-part sequence that I took all 3 of those, but I was hardly prepared to teach university level world history or Western Civ, but I did, and I learned on the job, and I taught it off and on for 4 decades, and every time I taught it, I learned. But I'm essentially what you would call an Americanist, and so I was prepared to be sure to teach U.S. history, but not really prepared to do Western Civ. So you definitely learn on the job, and that's okay. That's what I was fortunate in, that my school, my job, all became one thing, and there was no segregation of my life, my teaching, my research. It's just one big bundle.
One more question before we take a break. Would you have done something differently regarding your education or professional experience or networking or all of those kind of things if you were given the opportunity to return to graduate school?
Well, no, there's always this hindsight there, what you may or may not have done, but I've been blessed and have had a tremendous career. Now, certainly I'm at the College of Southern Idaho, and with all due respect, back in the day, I was at the University of Washington and was in line to go and teach at a four-year university somewhere. And the fact that my mentor passed away, and I went back to Boise State and started working full-time and working on a dissertation and having a family, that was and changing my focus from Latin American history to I'm a generalist. I became a international relations, diplomatic history, and now I don't want to mislead you. I'm happy to be a generalist, and I'm happy teaching. I always wanted to be a teaching historian, and that's what I got to do. But I spent 10, 15 years working to be a research scholar at a big four-year institution. And I was on the path to working at a major school in a Latin American history position. And so I had a transition in my career there where I sort of committed to being a teaching historian at a smaller school and getting out of the what they call in the academy, publish or perish. When I was getting my PhD, you had to get a PhD to teach at a four-year college. And then if you wanted to keep your job, you had to write a book or two. And if you didn't write a book or two, then you would lose your job. You would not get tenure. And so that was the climate that I grew up in, was that I would publish and I would write a book and I would have a tenured career at a four-year college, which would require me moving. Of course, I had an insight or a foot in the door at Boise State, and I had visions of teaching at Boise State for the rest of my career. I was the director of Canadian Studies there, but that didn't really work out, and I had to make a shift. I had to change, and of course, when I came to CSI, my career shifted from that four-year college and kind of publish or perish to teaching and public history, because at the community college, almost by definition, then you're connected to the community and doing community kinds of things. And that's what I've been doing fairly actively at the College of Southern Idaho in Twin Falls.
Thank you so much. Let's take a break. I'm just going to pause the recording. All right, so we're back to recording after a short break. The next major topic of the interview is about student preparedness. And specifically, tell me about students. What skills are paramount in your field to pass on to students?
Complicated question there, Professor Matthews. The skills, we want reading and writing. And for all of my years in teaching, it was to stress reading and writing. That's what historians do. And that's what students do. Now I'm from a time it was called writing across the curriculum that you know all about. And that is, regardless of what field of study, you would be reading and writing. And so I want students to be able to read and write, to think critically about what they're reading, and to share the story or the interpretation or the analysis of the material in front of them. And so those are the most important skills. And that's a little bit of a slippery concept, how you don't teach critical thinking skills. I guess you do, but it's a hard thing to measure. If students have critical thinking skills, it's but you can determine if they're reading, if they can read and understand and write about it, communicate it. And now there's one other leg there that's always been maybe a piece of that, and they should be able to communicate it orally. At the your college there, they believe in the importance of oral communication. It's a requirement. So universities have fundamentals of speech, that's something you should take. If what is an educated person? Well, they should be able to talk. So now in terms of my classes, that's or my teaching, that's not as important as reading and writing, because there's a lot of really smart kids that read and write and can think critically and be prepared to do the work of history and cultural resource management without necessarily being a powerful public speaker. My mentor, I forgot to mention earlier, Dr. Sims, like to say there's a lot more than being dynamic. So yeah, you got to have knowledge, and you get that from reading, and then you need to be able to articulate that. I'll never forget attending a conference in Utah when I was here at CSI. What is an educated person conference? And it was a computer business, a CEO of the largest computer company in Utah, and a lot of history, humanities faculty there. What does industry want in terms of being prepared to go to college? And I about fainted when the CEO went on and on and on about he wanted students to be able to read and write, because what they had to do in the job was to read reports, prepare reports, communicate, and students were coming to his enterprise unable to read and write. We were worried about years ago students coming from, grade school or high school, come to the university, they should be able to read and write. And of course, he was worried that they would be able to read and write effectively coming out of college. I would have thought there, Professor Matthews, he would have stressed, computer skills, these technical skills. And so I'm very much a believer in students reading and writing. And so there's a base of knowledge now. In history, you can't know everything. The field is too overwhelming there. And so what we specialize in is how to find things. I was once encouraged to go get a degree in library science. And so we have a lot of information, we organize it, but we have a problem, a history problem, history question. And so research skills, how do you find things? And then of course, engaging in the research process, which is, I suppose, an important skill there, but that's reading and critical thinking and writing. So yeah, the basic skills, certainly at the undergraduate level, are how to deal with documents, know the difference between primary, secondary sources, being able to put them into a sort of a basic historical context, and being able to share it in a written and maybe or maybe not an oral format. I know today it would be presenting it in a format like we're dealing with here, in some kind of technical format, in a PowerPoint, or I guess that's old technology.
All right, thank you. Okay, let me look on this. So I'm like reviewing the questions, making sure that a lot of those you answered already. What were some of the challenges your students have experienced during their education that you're aware of?
Right. So challenges, my 2 decades of teaching at Boise State, and then when I came to CSI, everyone asked the question, what was the difference between Boise State students and CSI students? And of course, I always would respond, there's a lot of good students over there, there's a lot of bad students. And the same is true of CSI, and there's just different number of students. But certainly working, I had to work all my time through undergraduate years, and I was able to become a successful student once that I got financial support and didn't have the burden of working. So students working, having life life is the main thing that gets in the way. And so balancing, family and friends and your school, and then your work as you go along and from school to practicing. The thing that Denier, that for me was language. When I was at University of Washington, there were so many Asian students, and the Asian students were just brilliant and outstanding students, but expressing their understanding of the material, given the language situation, and at CSI, of course, lots of Hispanic students, and my Spanish is no está bien, and so that language barrier and concomitant with that is sort of the cultural barrier. I mean, you mentioned the Juan's, the people at Juan's closing down the restaurant for a month and going to Mexico to see La Familia. So in our country, you don't put family before school. And in Hispanic culture, maybe you do. So there's cultural differences, there's language differences, there's economic differences. And, if you have to work and go to school, that's a grind, and that's a tough deal. And if you're privileged to where you get to just go to school and go and be serious. So many people have the privilege to go to school, and they don't take it seriously. They blow it off, as we say. And then I've had 1,000 students that have been to me and say, boy, I wish I'd have been serious when I was 18, 19, 20, and now I'm 30 and I'm serious. And a lot of students go to school and it's covered. And, I went there, I paid for it out of my own pocket, and I had to work, construction site. So yeah, I think life is the main obstacle to being a successful student.
So kind of
Oh,
related.
and Danny, let me just say one more thing,
Sorry.
because you're very familiar to this, and this is really a critical one. When I say life, it's that people who are not going to school in the university environment or the college environment, the rest of the world doesn't really understand, homework and reading assignments and final exams, and quite frankly, they don't have a lot of sympathy. I was a college student for 16 years, and the rest of the world has no real understanding of that world. And so you're always operating with, folks out in the regular old workplace, and as a college student, the college faculty, you're in a little different place with a little bit different rhythm, and that's always a tension. Thanksgiving gets in the way of finals.
It's true. Kind of looping around again about the skill transfer from one generation to the next. In archaeology, we have a set obligation to pass down our knowledge to the next generation. I'm going to put a caveat with that, because the thing that has happened in archaeology is that we've had a very strong repositioning towards applied archaeology. We're talking about applied history, now it's applied archaeology, and that is making archaeology available for the public. And that we in our professional organizations feel compelled to advocate for students to kind of lead the way to transfer the skills from one generation to the next. The question I'm kind of following up on this is going back to where that CEO said, I need them to read and write. So given that students read and write and have critical thinking skills, who in the community should be responsible for that transfer of knowledge from one generation? Is it the employer? Is it the professional archaeologists and associations? Is it the educational classrooms? Is it, internships? Like, where do you see students getting the majority of their skills from, and knowing what skills to develop maybe on their own?
Well, I think that it's important for students to get experience outside of the classroom. And so you learn and then you go out and practice the internships. And doing history. So we, as historians, applied history or public history, were, in my case, I'm an academic historian and classroom professor, and so public history is taking history not to students but to the general public. And how do we make historical sites available and understandable to the general public, and to and maybe to educate the general public, and to entertain, but really provide information about the community's past, the state's past, about the particular sites, particular events, and so we might call that adult education, but public histories for youngsters and students and non-students. But there's a difference between academic history at the university, and which in my case is reading books and interpretations, historiography, and analyzing the past. Public history is preserving history, telling those stories in a way that is consumable for the general public, as opposed to, students and graduate students and academic geeks like you and me.
Thank you very much. I have one final question, and that is, can you think of any questions I didn't ask?
No, those are a set of really fine questions, and hope that I've been able to offer some insights. I think rather than other questions, just by final thoughts, it's in addition to knowledge, whatever your profession is, and certainly cultural resources is one thing, you have to have a passion. It means you can't just have passion. There's lots of people love history, but you have to do your homework. You got to know your name, states, and facts. You got to know your bibliography, and then that's a starting point. And then you got to maybe sort of go out and be active, and that should come naturally. So, good teachers, good anthropologists, good historians, that you have a passion, and you have to believe it's important. I like to say when I would teach class that if I couldn't convince students that history was important to them, to our community, if it wasn't important to me, then I couldn't hardly expect it to be important to them. So I think if you're going into curriculum, resource management, anthropology, history, law, medicine, follow that passion, and that's sort of that ingredient that is vital to be successful in your career.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop recording now.